Ooh, that's bright. Pretty great GCAP, right? So it's a real honour to be asked to help close out the entirety of GCAP 2018, and it's a real honour to share the space with all the people who've contributed, both through the talks they've given and the support that they've provided, and all of the work behind the scenes through the entirety of GCAP. I'm delighted to be a part of it, and I'm super stoked to be sharing this moment with Ken and Ali. And I think one of the things that is important in a closing keynote is that you kind of have to summarise and condense the entire experience of the show and recapitulate and revive the theme, and hopefully provide a little bit of closure. And in a small way, I hope I can help with that, and also kind of set up some loose threads that I trust Ken and Ali will close out, or at least make it their problem. So the theme is about the walls we've built, and a lot of people have talked about those walls, but I think one of the things that we talk about less is why we built those walls in the first place. You know, walls keep us safe. Walls hold up our roofs. Walls delineate space into inside and outside. We didn't build the walls by accident. I mean, I've been here through most of the wall building process, right? When we talk about these walls, I go back 20 years. I saw the last time all the walls fell down, and I've helped to build a few since. And I want to talk about what that means as we go on to be responsible for those walls. But the walls were a response to the pressures, you know, to the wind that blows and cools us down, especially in Melbourne. It's a response to the strangers that intrude upon us. It's a response to the privacy we seek, the nest we try and build. We build walls because we're scared of what's outside. And on fear, I was talking to Ali, and you'll be lucky enough to hear from her directly in a moment, but I was talking about the people that she mentors, and she said that a lot of them are scared. You know, they're scared of the business, they're scared of the lack of prospects, they're scared of the unknown, they're scared of the way games is headed. And I think that means that they've been paying attention because it's scary. I'm scared. It's a scary time. Like, there are a lot of uncertain winds blowing against our walls at the moment. The industry feels a lot less secure and less certain for me than it has for a very long time. The world feels a lot less secure and a lot less certain. And it's interesting when we think about walls to think about how the walls that we used to have came down and how that started the moment that we're now, it feels, reaching the end of, the birth of those open platforms. Mobile really paved the way for independent developers to have a way to find a market and commercial opportunities that they didn't previously have. And that let indies go from doing creative work to building businesses. And when we talk about businesses and the themes of GCAP, I want to stick a pin in that. I will come back to businesses, but not right now. So mobile started that whole set of wheels rolling. And the thing is that if you look around now, mobile is a pretty tough place right now. Thankfully, Steam came along, but Steam is a pretty tough place right now. But thankfully, the Switch came along. But the Switch is a pretty tough place right now. VR hasn't quite come along yet, but VR is a pretty tough place right now. And there are new waves and opportunities, but it also feels like there's a lot of us leaping to the new waves and opportunities. Maybe AR will be filled with content before AR even arrives. There are lots of tough places right now. So, I want to pull that pin back out of the word business. And it was really Ken who helped focus my attention and bring my attention to the word business. People who know me probably know that I'm pretty business focused. I pay a lot of attention to the business of games. I and my business partner Dan watch the charts like a hawk. I'm really interested in how the businesses of indie developers around the world are going. I feel a slightly paternalistic sensitivity to the successes and trials of Australian developers, and I watch them and I cheer for them when they succeed. And the way I learned to run a business was from my grandfather, who passed away this year at the ripe old age of 88, doing what he loved, which was training horses. And he trained horses with a lot of the other members of my family every day. And the way he did that was to wake up in the morning, sit with the other members of the family over breakfast and write in the book what they would do that day on the basis of what had happened yesterday. And then you would come in to lunch and a cup of tea and you would, well, I guess the professional term for it is gossip. And you'd gossip about everybody, you know, the owners and what they were doing, what people down the street were doing, and that was the way that you got a sense of, you know, who was doing what, who had which horses, what was doing well, and you'd gossip about the horses that were your livelihood and your friends, and what they were doing and what they needed and how they could be better. And in essence, that's kind of what Dan and I do every day, is sit and look around at what's going on. So I'm guilty of being business focused, but I really think that a business is not the only model. And I'm really thankful to the work that various people, Brendan Keogh and Paul Callaghan in particular, have done to help draw my attention to games outside of industry, games as a broader thing. We need to define a broader range of success, and we need to think so much about how we celebrate the broader range of success. We need to think of models that aren't a company. We need to think of bands and auteurs and collaborators and muses and facilitators and so many other ways that work can be produced if we want, and I think we do, a broader range of success and a broader range of creation. We need to celebrate those models. So a big underlying topic of this GCAP has been, how do we pass the baton on? How do old sods like myself help to bring up a new wave of people? And it's interesting because when I talk to people in the film and television industry, one of the things they bemoan is the end of the soap opera, Neighbours and Home and Away, because those were places that just an enormous amount of work was done and an enormous amount of material flowed out of. I'm not suggesting soap operas are great. I am not personally a fan, but so many of the Australian writers of today cut their teeth in that industry because you had to do a show every day. And I think that's a thing in games that we fall away from. We have these 6-month schedules, these 12-month schedules, these 2-year schedules, these 5-year schedules. We get out of the practice of doing work and we make it so hard for people to come in, do work, learn and move on. The one thing I want to say about walls that I think is super important is it is not the responsibility of the newcomers to break down those walls. We built them. And I mean, like, you in this room. What are you scared of? What have you built to keep you safe? Is it still working for you? The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs talks about what a city is distinct from a town. It's a great book, and it looks at kind of what happens in the 50s in urban planning in America. And it explains that a city is a place where you meet a lot of strangers. That's what defines it and keeps it apart. And a city, ironically, is at its safest when the footpaths are filled with people, when there is bustle. And it's safe because that means that there are people who will watch those footpaths because it's entertaining, things go on. There are other people on the streets, there are strangers who band together and form an ad hoc community of that moment. There's a density of strangers that ironically makes you a lot safer. But cities started turning away from the footpaths that they were built on. People started building individual buildings that were blocked off with their own pools inside, with their own facilities, with their own elevators. They started building houses that were turned away from the streets. You need to have people engaged in the bustling world to keep you safe. You're not safe when those walls stop the movement. And you're not safe when your door only lets in the people you know. You're safe when you're surrounded by strangers and learning new things. And I think one of the most important things to do for the people in this room are creators, right? We are all clever. We can build better walls. We can build walls that have doors and windows. We can build walls that allow people to flow in and out. We can learn something that we didn't know before. You'll never learn a new thing without opening yourself up to the unknown, which is scary. I am scared. I think a lot of people are scared. But I really encourage you to be scared and let people in anyway. Punch open those doors. And with that note, I'd like to pass the baton to Ken.
Thanks, Morgan. So I was telling an out-of-town guest yesterday that to me, GCAP feels like really Australian. Now, Australia, we're not the biggest of countries, but we love being the underdog, and we love having a crack at it. We love helping out our mates do the same. And I also think a cultural trait that we've adopted is one of introspection. Most of us are here today at this fancy convention center in South Bank because this land was invaded and taken away from its original people. I think to be Australian is to take a good hard look at how we got here and to be honest about some of the pain and failure of the past and to figure out how to make things better. In this way, I think the walls we built ourselves is a really Australian theme. In the past 2 days, we've taken a good hard look at how we got here as an industry, and we've discussed all these ideas about how to move forward. In Leighton Gray's incredible and inspiring opening keynote yesterday, she referred to David Foster Wallace's E Unibus Plurum essay, calling for anti-rebels or new rebels. And though written in 1993, I was struck by how poignant this notion is for the video game industry in 2018. Video games felt kind of like counterculture in the 80s and 90s. Society and our parents told us that video games were bad for us, but we played them anyway. We fought for the right for Doom and Mortal Kombat to be violent and ridiculous like any other art form. When we were told that video games would never amount to anything, we chose to study how to make games, to offer our services as freelancers, and to make games our careers. Despite social norms and negative stereotypes, we cosplay and we stream and we integrate gaming into our identity. Being active in video games sometimes feels like a series of small and large acts of defiance. But what happens when video games have grown up and have become mainstream? What happens when video games are the system, the machine, the Super Bowl ad? I think that the rebellion that video games need now is one of caring. In 2018, one of the most punk, transgressive, brave, badass things that you can do is to care about each other. For us to care, to take better care of our coworkers, of our employees, of our audiences, and of ourselves. This morning, during the lightning talks, Tony Albrecht asked us to ask ourselves if what we're doing is useful. The real rebels will make games that help us understand each other and make the world a better place. The next rebels will make games that educate and explore and solve the world's problems. We got really good in the past few decades at making straight games, at epic games, at addictive games. What the rebellion needs now is queer games, political games, poetic games. For as long as video games have existed, we built walls to control who these games are for and who built them. From the Nintendo seal of quality, which kept out amateurs and hackers off of the most popular platform of the day, to the invention of the teenage boy as a primary audience. But we've made so much progress since then, I think. Games have become so much more democratic over time. I've always held that today it's never been easier and cheaper to buy games, and it's never been easier and cheaper to learn how to make games. However, we must never stop identifying the walls that we as a community and as an industry built, which continue to divide us. The walls that I've been thinking about for these past 2 days include walls between the English-speaking world and the rest of the world, between those of us who are fortunate enough to be making a sustainable living from our craft, and those who are working on projects while struggling to make rent, and those of us who have chosen to have our day jobs while working in games as a hobby. And I think about the walls between the world of gaming and the rest of society. Consider the very walls that we've built around this conference and around this industry and this art form. Once we leave this room, consider what we could be learning from people of other professions and other walks of life. What can we be learning from people who don't make games and don't play games? We must also be vigilant to new walls that are being built up every day. I think about the gender disparity in esports, which is even worse than the rest of our industry. I think about the idea of women-only leagues, and is that the solution or part of the solution? And in line with that, when do diversity initiatives, which always have great intentions, when do they do more to actually separate and isolate? When we raise up our heroes, and I say this on a stage, are we distancing ourselves from them? Are we creating separation? How are platforms determining who succeeds and who fails? And who isn't in this room? Who couldn't afford to be here? Who felt unwelcome here? When I was a slightly younger man, my heroes were people who built companies in order to create the technology to create new art. I'm talking about Steve Jobs, George Lucas, and James Cameron. These are like my heroes growing up. They're all visionaries, they're auteurs, and all of them are American capitalist men with terrible people skills. Now, the lessons that I've learnt from these men still inform my work and my passions. But I've had to become more aware of their flaws and how that impacted their work and their industries, and the importance of not repeating their mistakes. Now, I also run a company which creates technology in order to create new art. I'm a worker, but I'm also now a leader and an employer. And as I think you've heard plenty of times during this conference, I need to live up to, not just live up to Steve Jobs and James Cameron and George Lucas, I need to do better. But along the way, my heroes have changed. My heroes these days are people like Kamina Vincent, my incredible producer. My heroes now include Lauren Klinick, Lisi Kane, Tony Reed, Liam Esler, Chad Toprak, and Lee Shang-lun. My heroes are folks like Morgan Jaffit and Ali McLean, and Rami Ismail and Kate Edwards, and Emily Grace Buck. In other words, my heroes are people who build bridges between communities and who help out those with less voice and power and opportunity. They also happen to be incredibly caring and empathetic souls, many of whom I get to work with in my local community. Now, I wouldn't work 100-hour weeks for these people, but I would gladly volunteer my time for them and be on panels for them and be on panels with them. As we bring down the walls that keep us apart, every one of us in this room can also be building bridges. Games Week isn't over yet. There's still lots of time to meet new people, and perhaps they are people that you can learn from. Perhaps they're also someone that you could help out. I've found in my career, the more that I give, the more that I'm given back. And on that note, I'm going to pass the baton to Ali McLean.
Oh, goodness. Didn't fall over on my way up, so step one, tick. So before I do get started, I do just want to give a really brief content warning. Towards the end of my talk, I am going to touch on the Me Too movement a little bit. If this makes you uncomfortable, I'm not going to be offended if you want to step out or look at your phone or tune me out. So feel free to do that. Okay, so when Morgan and Ken and I first started talking about this theme, we sort of came to two of the questions that Morgan mentioned at the beginning. What are you most scared of? And what gives you hope? And in thinking about those things and trying to answer those questions, I just have more questions. But the questions are for you. My hope is that with our powers combined, all of the creators and makers and doers of various things in this room will collectively resolve these questions in time and continue the conversation and ask more questions. So it was really not that long ago that I started my career in games. And so the fears and anxieties that I felt standing outside of those walls are still very fresh in my mind. Some of them have changed, some of them have grown, but some of them have subsided. I remember coming to my first GCAP only a few years ago and being so intimidated by what I felt like was lots of unspoken rules and secret knowledge that I didn't have. I was so intimidated that I couldn't summon the courage to actually go into a talk. Not a talk that I was giving, just anyone else's talk. So I spent the whole of GCAP kind of like a vampire who you haven't yet invited into your house, just like hovering around. So if you've been feeling that way and you made it into this room today, you are already doing better than I was. But before I speak to those people in the room who have those fresh fears, I first want to speak to the people who have been part of building those walls and those structures, or have already found a way in. As Morgan touched on, I think there's a lot of responsibility that lies with that. But I also think what I've seen is a lot of uncertainty and insecurity and fear about what to do with that position. So when I think of what I'm most scared of still about the walls we've built ourselves, I think mostly about the establishment. When we talk about the establishment, I think it conjures images of government bodies and like shadowy executives, but put that aside for a moment. And I want you to think more about the microstructures. We each have to acknowledge, regardless of what stage of the journeys we're at, we have to acknowledge our parts in contributing to structures that keep others out. This has been a huge learning for me this year, inadvertently contributing to creating exclusionary spaces in a quest for inclusion. To push that even further, I think there's a conversation to be had about knowledge share. Personally, I'm at a very interesting stage in my career, where I seem to have ticked over a counter or appeared on a heat map in some secret room. So bear with me, you're going to experience what it's like to live in my brain for a second. So in my mind, all the leaders of the industry all hang out in a bat cave together, like surrounded by screens that are swirling, and there's holograms. You get the picture. And so they're all sitting around together, and then at some point, at any given moment, a new person will ping on a radar. They'll look at each other and nod solemnly. And then suddenly you start getting invited to all these secret Facebook groups and Slack channels and Google groups. It actually happens, and it all seems to happen at the same time, hence the conspiracy theory. So at first this is really exciting. You see familiar names of your game development heroes, and sometimes you even get to sit around a table with them and have dinner. But as this stage of my career continues, I have a growing sense of unease. And I think it comes on more, the more that I see truly valuable resources being shared in those closed rooms. Rooms that are inaccessible to people who perhaps might be in more dire need than the people who have access. And I can't help but think that those spaces themselves would also benefit from perspectives different to their own. We can't solve our problems in echo chambers. So how are these walls, the ones that protect knowledge, that can make or break livelihoods? In what way are these walls climbable for some, but not for others? And what purpose do they really serve? If we believe in the work that we're doing, and in our people, and in our games, and in our plans and our contingencies, why are we insecure about sharing information with people outside of our circles? How can we disassemble this establishment in a way that levels the playing field? And what can we all do to contribute to a culture that subsides the fear of honest sharing? I've had a conversation with a few people this week and over this year in general about, once you get to a stage in your career, choosing who you should be mentoring. So the first kind of myth or misconception that I'd bought into about mentorship that I can get rid of for you now is that mentees should be your younger self. This is a lazy exercise in ego, and it doesn't help anybody. If we only foster the futures of people who we see ourselves in, people who are exactly like us, we're gatekeeping the industry, and we're preventing new voices from revolutionizing the way that we make games, in a time where we need to revolutionize the way we make games. This isn't to say that it's wrong to help somebody if you see yourself in them. One of our strongest mentorship pairs in the working lunch this year is actually between two people, and I think some of them might be here, who are so eerily similar that when they first met, we had someone check if they were related. This isn't to say that mentoring, you shouldn't help someone if they're similar to you. I simply mean that we shouldn't see similarity as a requirement for helping each other. Good mentorship is all about two-way learning. The more you give, the more you get. So the other thing I'm afraid of is the walls we build around ourselves. the walls that start to make us look like buried ruins. I spend a lot of my time talking to people about becoming mentors, talking to some of the industry's most impressive and accomplished and well-known people. The most disheartening and concerning part of that experience is how many mentors, particularly women, don't feel that they are qualified to help. There are 3 big walls you have to break down when you're telling someone that they can help others. The first one is usually self-deprecation. On a personal and industry-wide front, can we please stop putting ourselves down? From an industry perspective, for all of our insistence that we want to be taken seriously, that we are a juggernaut bigger than film and music combined, we still crack a lot of jokes at our own expense. Maybe we should interrogate why we as a group seem to be insecure about our jobs. So why do we do this? On a personal level, I see a lot of mentors do it to be more relatable, to not be intimidating. We put ourselves down in a mission to connect. So I was called out on doing this myself, and I've developed sort of 3 things that I tell myself every time I'm going into a situation like this, where I want to put on a front, at least, that I believe in everything that I'm doing. So these are mine, but you should develop your own. So the first one is to take a compliment as eagerly as you give them, and to think about it as a way to learn. So if we think about receiving a compliment as a way to start a feedback loop, to share how you got to that point and open a conversation, it's a lot less about you and it's more about the community. And the second one is respect your audience. So whether it's an audience like this, or an audience of 1 in a meeting room, or the audience of your team, you're worth their time. They already decided that for you. You don't have a say in it. And the third one is to refer to the list. So the list is something that we tell people to make. How many people have ever had to do the MCV Pacific Trade Media Women in Games list? A bunch of people, yeah. So when you get on that list, they email you and they ask you to send them a dot point summary of everything you've ever done in your career. It's very intimidating. But when you start to do that, and when you go through that practice, you sit down and you say, what am I proud of? What do I want people to know that I've done? It's a very valuable resource to have, and I would encourage everyone to go away from GCAP and think about your list. What's the summary of you? And how do you want that list to look tomorrow, next year, in 5 years? The second line of defense when you're asking people to help, as we've heard, this is a scary and tough time. This thought of helping and breaking down walls sounds exhausting. A lot of people are just trying to keep their head above water, just trying to pay bills, just trying to do their own thing, still trying to make something of themselves. And this is valid. But what this doesn't take into account is the inherent value that you get out of helping. It sounds difficult, and it will be at times. But to use the working lunch as one of many examples, there's not a single mentor in our program who hasn't come to me at the end of it and said how much they got out of being a mentor, how much they got out of giving, how much they grew from being in an environment that was focused on helping, on sharing knowledge, and on openness. So it's on us to build an industry culture that feels like that every time you walk into a room. You get what you give. And the last line of defense is, why me? What value do I have to give to others? We know that every path into games is unconventional, and very few two are the same. So what do you have that can help? There are 2 questions that we use to break down this wall. The first one, who helped you become who you are today? We all had someone or multiple people, whether it was a teacher or a mentor or a family member or a friend, who wasn't perfect, who didn't have all of the answers, but who helped us become who we are. You are that person for somebody else. The second one is, what did you need to hear when you started out? So maybe if you didn't have that person, maybe you can be that person for yourself. Think if you could reach back through time and tell yourself something you needed to know when you were first starting, and know that you can say that to someone today. The responses to these questions are what gives me hope for how we'll navigate this next stage together. Something else that gives me hope is accountability. And I don't think that it would be right to talk about walls without talking about this. I don't think it would be fair to say that the games industry really experienced the Me Too movement the way that some other creative industries did. We should probably think hard on why. Do underrepresented people really feel necessary in this industry? Does anything make us feel like you couldn't all just go on without us if we became too difficult? Are the barriers preventing us from speaking also stopping us from protecting each other? I want to acknowledge that similar to film and music in many ways, same. I want to acknowledge how hard it is to work in games when you have been a victim of harassment or assault by a person in a position of power or influence. Games, despite its size, still feels like a very small industry, even globally. Everyone seems to know everyone. Like in film, games can have hundreds of thousands of contributors, and hit games are worshipped not just by fans but by developers, by our co-workers. Victims are often surrounded by and bombarded with hero worship of people who hurt them. It's not an easy thing to escape, and it's something I know that many of us suffer through silently, and many leave the industry altogether. And how could we blame them? We're not doing as much as we could to protect these people yet. What I have seen this year, though, is a little more accountability. Even in the lead up to Games Week this year, I've seen less Networking 101 and more, how do we protect each other? What do I do if someone is being inappropriate? I've also seen unionisation efforts put a spotlight on the importance of protecting workers when they're harassed just trying to do their job. It makes me really hopeful to see that shift happening, even if it is slow, towards acknowledging that inclusion is about more than allowing underrepresented people into your space. It's about protecting them from abuse of power. It's about protecting them from manipulation, from assault and harassment. And when we fail at that, it's about protecting them from the results of it. If you're feeling that way, you're not alone, and it is getting better. So on that note, I want to talk to the people who are outside of those walls. When asked what gives me hope, I think of you. I think of the over 100 applications we had to the Working Lunch this year, reading those applications and reading the motivation and the vision that the next wave has for the future of games. I want to tell you that whether you're at the very first steps of your career and these walls seem overwhelming, or whether you've made some leaps and didn't make it. At the start of this year, for many reasons, I didn't know if I would still be in the games industry by October, let alone giving this keynote. Mentorship, both being mentored and becoming a mentor, literally saved my career. I've asked you a lot of big questions that neither I, nor Ken, nor Morgan could give you the answers to. I'm still figuring it out. But what I am sure of is that whether you're chipping away at your own wall, or propping open secret passageways to share knowledge, or disassembling and reassembling the whole structure to become what it needs to support a changing landscape, you're not alone in this. Every bit counts. We are in charge of how this goes. Let's help each other shape the future into what it needs to be. Let's rebuild. Thank you.